Who returned live to the United Nations, the representative of Venezuela addresses the plenary meeting on the need to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba.
We'd also like to convey our affectionate greetings to His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Padilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, who is here with us today. Our delegation also subscribes to the statements made by the delegations of Uganda, Azerbaijan, San Vicente and the Grenadines, and Eritrea. Mr. President, we have no doubt that this will be the 31st consecutive year that this General Assembly will reiterate its almost universal call in favor of the lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade to which for over 60 years the Brethren Republic of Cuba has resisted with great courage, conscience, and a sense of patriotic unity, always keeping its head held high without bowing to blackmail or taking down its revolutionary banner. This is a blockade that is illegal because it violates all norms of international law and the principles enshrined in the founding charter of this organization. This is a blockade that is a criminal because it generates death, pain, and indiscriminate suffering of an entire people. This is a blockade that is inhumane because it deliberately and systematically violates the human rights of over 11 million Cubans, and that today represents the main obstacle for the achievement of its inalienable right to development. This is a blockade that represents a collective punishment that deepens inequalities, social exclusion, and systemic racism, and whose pernicious effects are clear crimes against humanity. This is a policy of maximum pressure to which no Cuban family is immune, and that could be compared to a declaration of war, given that this economic aggression, as is well known and has been amply documented, has an impact that is as destructive and lethal as those generated by conventional wars. This criminal blockade is also constitutes a policy of economic terrorism that, due to its extraterritoriality, affects any country or entity that seeks to maintain legally and in a sovereign fashion economic, commercial, or financial relations with the Brethren Republic of Cuba, while at the same time the blockade prevents the Cuban state from having access to the international financial system, as well as gaining credit facilities, financing facilities, including for its development. What it isn't, in spite of the affirmations of the U.S. government to try to justify its aggression, what it isn't is a simply bilateral matter or an embargo directed exclusively against Cuba, because this anachronistic and erroneous policy affects the entire international community. Even worse, this is a blockade that has been expanded and worsened in recent years after the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Law and the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba in a unilateral list that qualifies it as a supposed promoter of terrorism. Mr. President, in spite of all the above, the imperial policy of the United States has not managed, or nor will it ever manage, to achieve its goals in the socialist Cuba of Martí, in the revolutionary Cuba of Fidel, because the people of this brethren country is determined to exercise its inalienable right to self-determination and to define in a free, independent, and sovereign way its political, economic, social, and cultural system. In spite of all the above, Cuba continues today to renovate its humanist mission and its spirit of cooperation and solidarity by providing support and technical assistance in a disinterested way to a large number of countries, including Venezuela, in various areas such as education, sports, health, culture, and many others. Cuba has taught us, not by preaching, but by its actions, the true meaning of solidarity. To give what we have plenty of, but what we lack. it is difficult for today's generation to forget the contributions of the dozens of brigades of Cuban doctors that were deployed for many years at over 35 countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Europe to save the lives of millions of people during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. It will also be impossible to forget how, through its own efforts, and in spite of the difficulties imposed by this criminal blockade, Cuba managed to develop 5 vaccines against COVID-19, and which it put at the disposal of entire peoples. That is the great contrast between the humanist vision of our sister Cuba and the supremacist and imperial vision of the United States, whose government has recklessly tasked thousands of officials to extort dozens of countries that are experiencing disease and suffering. We have to ask ourselves how much more Cuba could give us, how much more it could offer to expand its international cooperation if all the hurdles that have been imposed on it illegally in an arbitrary way over the past 60 years would have been lifted. How much how many more resolutions does this General Assembly have to adopt so that an end is put to this criminal blockade? Perhaps we haven't understood well enough that today's world doesn't need any more blockades or unilateralism. Mr. President, the obsolete, unjust, illegal, and cruel policy of asphyxiation imposed by the United States against Cuba through this illegal blockade represents a system of unilateral coercive measures that is the most unjust, severe, and prolonged that has ever been applied against any country in modern history. According to official figures, over these past 6 decades, the blockade has resulted in losses that exceed $159 billion, to which is to be added an unimaginable human cost. All this is mentioned in the most recent report of the Secretary General. This is a true crime that affects all of us equally, because this is a denial of political, economic, and cultural diversity of this planet. It's a denial of our right to national sovereignty. Even worse, this is an attack against an entire system of international relations with which Washington is seeking to impose its dominion on the rights of hundreds of countries. So I would like to make an appeal that we must demand that the government of the United States respect the Charter of the United Nations, respect international law, and that it put an end to any measure that threatens international peace and security, including the criminal application of blockades and other arbitrary and unilateral measures, such as the inclusion of Cuba in a list in which it should never have been listed, and even today categorizes it as a supposed promoter of terrorism, when in reality, it is the government of the United States that not only promotes this despicable scourge, but in fact protects and even offers safe haven to its perpetrators. Mr. President, the time has come that once and for all, the clamor of the immense majority is heeded. A majority that in unison demands the immediate and definitive end to all misleadingly named sanctions regimes, including the embargo imposed against Cuba. It is time to put an end to double standards and the application of international justice and in promotion of the rule of law and in protection of human rights. We shouldn't continue to tolerate violations committed up to now in complete impunity by regimes that, contemptuous towards global opinion, have converted this state, the United States, into the most isolated state in the world, whose harmful actions do damage to the well-being of our peoples and their right to live in peace and in development. Mr. President, when tomorrow the draft resolution contained in document A/78 /L5 will be submitted for consideration, our country will once again not be able to vote in favor of this text due to precisely the application of a criminal blockade imposed illegally against Venezuela by the United States. However, we strongly and decisively support this draft resolution and would like to conclude our intervention to vote massively in favor of this draft, to vote in favor of this document, whose operative paragraphs we hope will lead to concrete actions that will lead to an urgent lifting of the blockade, is to vote in favor of the independence of Cuba. It is to vote in favor of international legality and multilateralism. And lastly, and no less importantly, it is vote in favor of the end of neo-colonial projects of attempted domination and oppression, using embargoes and unilateral sanctions that have no place in 21st century and ultimately will be condemned to failure. Let us then continue to overwhelmingly support the heroic people of Cuba in its just demands. Cuba, yes. Blockade, no. Hasta la victoria siempre. To victory always. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela,